السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continuing with relatively short chapters in the Quran, today we explain the verses in surah Takwir, chapter 81. The name Takwir, which is taken from verse 1, has been translated as darkening, but it really means turning or folding up. This surah, which is a Meccan chapter, may be divided into two parts, each of them treating one major principle of faith, usul, deen. The first is the principle of resurrection, qiyamah, accompanied by a great upheaval in the universe, which affects the sun and the stars, the mountains and the seas, heavens and the earth, wild animals, as well as man. The second principle is that of revelation. The surah has something to say about the angels carrying the divine revelation, the prophet receiving it, and the people addressed by it. And the fact that the news of the resurrection day is not some kind of myth or fantasy. At the end, the believers and those seeking the truth are invited to Quran. The rhythm of the surah is one of violent movements which leave nothing in its place. Everything is thrown away, folded up, smashed, or scattered. The movement is so violent that it excites and frightens. It changes every familiar situation and shakes people's hearts. In such a violent, destructive storm, the human heart is no more than a little feather blown in every direction. No protection, and indeed no safety, can be found except what is granted by Allah, the Eternal. Therefore, the rhythm of the surah has on its own the effect of pulling man's heart and soul away from everything associated with safety and security in order to seek peace and safety and protection with God. The surah is also a collection of striking images drawn from the universe in both its present beautiful condition, which is familiar to us, and its condition on the day of resurrection, when every familiar thing is changed. It's changed beyond recognition. As usual, we go through the verses one by one and rely on other verses from Quran for further explanation. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا الشمس كورت. When the sun with its spacious light is folded up, overthrown. The whole chapter revolves around qiyamah, the resurrection day. Here, takwir, or folding up, implies the demise of sun. The folding up the sun could also mean that it will cool down and its flames, which stretch out for thousands of miles in the space, will dwindle down and die. This verse was revealed at the time when Greeks and Arabs believed the universe will always be there and will never die away until Quran was revealed. And later was confirmed by science. For example, George Gamow, a Russian-American theoretical physicist and cosmologist who was an early advocate and developer of the mature Big Bang theory, and others have acknowledged the demise of the sun. In his book called The Birth and Death of the Sun, Gamow lays out how did our sun come about. How did it come into being? What keeps it hot and luminous? And what will be its ultimate fate? وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ. And when the stars lose their luster and shine, meaning fall and disperse. Inkedar means fall and collapse, and also darkening. Stars take their brightness from the sun. The falling of the stars could also mean that they will break away from the system which holds them together and lose their light and brightness. Only God knows which stars will be affected by this event. Will it affect only a small group of stars, say our own solar system or our galaxy, which comprises hundreds of millions of stars, or will it affect all the stars in their millions of millions? The universe, as everyone knows, comprises an almost infinite number of galaxies, each with its own space. وَإِذَا الْجِبَالُ سُيِّرَتْ, and when the mountains are made to move away. After talking about the sun and the stars, it brings our attention to Earth and the biggest solid object in it, namely mountains. As they move and turn into particles and dust. As Quran refers in Surah Taha, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْجِبَالِ فَقُلْ يَنْسِفُهَا رَبِّي نَسْفًا. And they ask you concerning the mountains, say, my Lord will uproot them and scatter them as dust. Chapter 20, verse 105. Or in another verse, when the mountains crumble away and scatter into fine dust. Chapter 56, verse 5. Or in another verse, and when the mountains are made to move away and seem to have been a mirage. Chapter 78, verse 20. All these verses refer to a certain event which will affect the mountains and do away with their firm foundations and stability. This may be the beginning of the quake which will shake the earth violently, and which is mentioned in Surah 99, the earthquake, إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا وَأَخْرَجَتِ الْأَرْضُ أَثْقَالَهَا. When the earth is rocked with her final earthquake, when the earth shakes off her burdens. Chapter 99, verses 1 and 2. All these events will take place on that very, very long day. وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ أُطِّلَتْ, and when the pregnant camels are abandoned. Ishar refers to a 10 months pregnant camel. In this state, she is to the Arabs his most valuable possession, because she is about to add to his wealth a highly valued young camel, and to give him a lot of milk which he and his family will share with the newborn animal. However, on that day, which will witness such overwhelming events, such priceless camels will be left without care, completely unattended. The Arabs, who were the first to be addressed by this verse, never left such camels unattended, except for the gravest of dangers. And, that was the most valued possession to an Arab. But today, many of us, we don't have camels anymore, so therefore, this verse would apply to the most valuable possession we might have. Furthermore, in Surah Abas, Quran describes it as يَوْمَ يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ وَأُمِّهِ وَأَبِيهِ وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَبَنِيهِ. In that day, each person will flee from his own brother, and from his mother and his father, and from his wife and his children. Chapter 80, verses 34 through 36. وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ, and when wild animals are herded together. Surah continues with animals in that day. They usually run away from each other. In that day, they forget their mutual enmity and move together unaware of their direction. They neither seek their home nor chase their prey as they usually do. The overwhelming terror changes the character of even the wildest animals. What then will it do to human? Some commentators have also said that Husharat means all the animals will come alive. But this is unlikely because the context of these verses is about destruction of the world. وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ سُجِّرَتْ, and when the seas are set on fire, light up with fire. In that day, the seas light up on fire as the underground explosions occur. The Arabic term sujjara means that the seas will experience explosion, which sets them ablaze, as mentioned in Surah Infitar, which says, when the oceans are made to explode, chapter 82, verse 3. Such explosions may result from perhaps separating oxygen and hydrogen, which makes seawater. They could also be atomic explosions of some sort. If the explosions of a limited number of atoms in a hydrogen or atom bomb produce such dreadful consequences as we have seen, then the atomic explosion of the water, of the waters in the ocean, in whatever manners it may occur, will produce something much too fearful for our minds to visualize. Similarly, we cannot conceive the reality of hell, which stands beyond these vast oceans. وَإِذَا النُّفُوسُ زُوِّجَتْ, when the souls are sorted out, people reunited like with like. After reporting the situation of the universe, the surah gets into people's situation. Everyone with their own group, the believer with believers, idolater with idolaters, criminal with criminals. As the Quran says in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, خَافِضَةٌ رَافِعَةٌ, it will bring many low and it will exalt many. Chapter 56, verse 3. The pairing of souls could also mean the reunion of body and soul at the time of resurrection. We have other verses in Quran that talk about grouping, each group with their own. Then in verse 8 and 9 it says, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, when the female infant buried alive is questioned for what crime she was killed. Now, a brief view of trial held for the fathers who buried alive their infant daughters, an injustice committed by some of the pagan Arabs who used to bury their baby girls out of shame. But also, the verse addresses all the injustices being committed against the children through the times, even today. Here, this verse puts any child killer on trial. Of course, there was and still is another reason to kill babies, boy or girl, which was and still is fear of poverty and not being able to provide. Quran addresses that in another verse as it says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ مِنْ إِمْلَاقٍ نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ. Do not kill your children for fear of poverty. We provide for you and for them. Chapter 6, verse 151. So now a little more analysis and background on verses 8 and 9. So the value of human life must have sunk to a very low in pre-Islamic Arabian society. There existed a convention of burying young girls alive for fear of shame or poverty. The Quran describes this practice in order to portray its horror and denounce its practice, and it says it as a practice of ignorance or jahiliyyah. Its condemnation fits in perfectly with the declared aim of Islam to destroy jahiliyyah and save mankind from sinking to its depth. In Surah An-Nahl, we read, "When the birth of a girl is announced to one of them, his face grows dark, and he is filled with rage and inward grief. Because of the bad news, he hides himself from everybody. Should he keep her with disgrace or bury her under the dust? How ill they judge." Chapter 16, verses 58 and 59. So girls were killed in an extremely cruel way. They were buried alive. They did this in different ways. Some would leave the girl until she was 6 years old. Then the father would say to his wife to dress the girl in her best clothes and make her presentable. He would already have dug a hole in the desert. When the girl and the father got there, he would tell her that the hole is a well, and then tell her to look down the well. As she stood at the edge, he would push her into the hole, and she fell. And once she fell, he would throw sand over her and bury her. In certain tribes, when a pregnant woman was about to give birth, she would sit over a hole in the ground. When the baby was born, she would first establish its sex. If it was a boy, she would take him home, and if it was a girl, she would throw her in the hole and bury her. If a father decided not to bury his daughter alive, he would bring her up in a condition of deprivation until she was old enough to tend the sheep or cattle in the field, giving her only an overall jacket made out of rough wool to dress and making her to do this kind of work. Those Arabs who did not kill their young daughters or send them to mind the cattle had different methods of ill-treating the women. If a man died, the head of the clan would throw his gown over the widow. This was a gesture of acquisition, which means that the widow could not marry anyone except the owner of the gown. If he was attracted to her, he would marry her, paying absolutely no regard to her feelings. If he did not marry her, he would keep her until she died so he could inherit any money or property she might have had. Such was the attitude of Jahiliyyah society in Arabia toward women. Islam came and condemned this attitude and abolished all these practices. It forbids the murder of young girls and the babies, in fact, and shows its abhorrent and horrifying nature. And then they say Islam oppresses women. This act of Jahiliyyah is listed as one of the subjects of reckoning on the Day of Judgment, you see, in this chain of verses. Here the surah mentions it as one of the great events which overwhelms the universe in total turmoil. We are told that the murdered girl will be questioned about her murder. The surah leaves us to imagine how the murderer will be brought to account. The Jahiliyyah social order of the pre-Islamic period would never have helped women to gain a respectable, dignified position. That had to be decreed by God. The way of life God has chosen for mankind secures a dignified position for both men and women who share the honor of having a measure of the divine spirit breathed into them. Women owe their respectable position to Islam, not to any environmental factors or social setup. When one puts forward arguments in support of the fact that Islam is a divine religion and that it has been conveyed to us by God's messenger who received his revelation, one should state the changes made by Islam in the social status of women as being irrefutable. Nothing in the social setup of Arabia at the time pointed to such elevation for women. وَإِذَا الصُّحُفُ نُشِرَتْ, and when the records are laid upon. Verse 10. When each person's file is opened and speaks for itself, where sinners and criminals cannot deny anything. Quran explained this in Surah Isra. اقرأ كتابك كفى بنفسك اليوم عليك حسيبا. Read your record. Yourself suffices you this day as a reckoner against you. Chapter 17, verse 14. You can be witness against yourself. This in itself is hard to bear. Many people deep inside have hidden secret, the remembrance of which brings shame and shudder to its owner. Yet all secrets are made public on that eventful day. This publicity is representative of the great upheaval which develops in the whole universe. وَإِذَا السَّمَاءُ كُشِطَتْ, and when the sky is torn away, when the sky is stripped bare. Another sign where the sky is stripped away, meaning the order and constitution of stars is torn away. When the word sky is used, our first thought is the blue cover hoisted over our heads we call blue sky. Its stripping means the removal of that cover. How this happens remains a matter of conjecture. It is enough to say that when we look up, we will no longer see our familiar blue sky. We read in Surah Ibrahim, يَوْمَ تُبَدِّلُ الْأَرْضُ غَيْرَ الْأَرْضِ وَالسَّمَاوَاتُ وَبَرَزُوا لِلَّهِ. One day the earth will be changed to a different earth, and the heavens will also be changed. All shall come before Allah. Chapter 14, verse 48. The sky and the earth will be nothing like we know them today. The last scene is mentioned in the next two verses, verses 12 and 13. وَإِذَا الْجَحِيمُ سُعِّرَتْ وَإِذَا الْجَنَّةُ أُزْلِفَتْ. When hell is set ablaze, when Jahannam is set ablaze, made to burn fiercely, when hell is lit up basically with fire getting ready. وَإِذَا الْجَنَّةُ أُزْلِفَتْ, when the paradise is brought near. You know this, contrary to the way it says hell will be set to blazing fire, regarding paradise, Quran uses a welcoming tone as it says paradise is closing near. Regarding verse 12, where is hell? How does it burn? What fuel is used in lighting and feeding its fire? The only thing we know of it is that it is fueled of man and stones. Chapter 66, verse 6 says, O you who believe, save yourselves and your families from a fire whose fuel is people and stones. This is, of course, after they have been thrown in it. Its true nature and its fuel prior to that is part of God's knowledge. Heaven, on the other hand, is brought near to those who have been promised admission. They see it to be of easy access. Indeed, the expression here shows it ready to receive its dwellers. In Surah Al-Imran, it says, وَجَنَّةٍ عَرْضُهَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. And the paradise, as wide as are the heavens and the earth, prepared for those who are righteous, those who are God-conscious. Chapter 3, verse 133. When all these great events take place throughout the universe, changing the status of all life forms, no one can entertain any doubt about what they have done in this present life or what they have carried with them to the next life. As it says in the next verse, عَلِمَتْ نَفْسٌ مَا أَحْذَرَتْ. عَلِمَتْ نَفْسٌ مَا أَحْذَرَتْ. In that day, every soul shall know what it has put forward. Each person shall know what he or she has produced. This means everyone will look into what he has sent forward, what he has saved for this day. All the events mentioned in verses 1 through 13, like when the sun is folded, when the stars fall and disperse, when the mountains are made to move away, when the camels, 10 months pregnant, are left unattended, when the animals are brought together, when the seas are set on blazing fire, when people's souls are paired like with like, when the infant girl buried alive is asked for what crime she was slain, when the records are laid open, when the sky is stripped bare, when hell is made to burn fiercely, when paradise is brought near, all building up to this. عَلِمَتْ نَفْسٌ مَا أَحْذَرَتْ. Every soul shall know what it has put forward. Verse 14. In the midst of all these overwhelming events, every soul shall know for sure what sort of deeds he or she has brought, and that it cannot be changed, deleted, or added. People will find themselves completely separated from all that has been familiar to them and from their world as a whole. Everything will have undergone a total change except God. If man turns to God, he will find that his support is forthcoming when the whole universe is overwhelmed by change. This concludes the first part of the surah, leaving us with a vivid impression of the universal upheaval on the day of resurrection, qiyamah. These verses sketch a scene of great turmoil which envelopes the whole universe. It is an event which reveals every guarded secret and leaves nothing hidden away. Every human being faces what he has put forth for the day of reckoning or judgment. The great events mentioned indicate that the present familiar state of the universe, with its perfect harmony, with its measured movement, with its controlled relations, perfected by the Maker who works flawlessly all that will suffer a complete breakdown. Why? Because its mission will be completed. Along with all creation, it will move into new predetermined phase of life, unlike anything known to us in this world. The surah, the chapter, aims to get this idea of the inevitable mayhem well established in people's hearts and minds so that they may attach little or no importance to the values and riches of this world. While what happens here in this world due to our deeds will have lasting consequence. People should establish a firm bond with the everlasting truth, the truth of God, the eternal, who never changes when everything else changes and disappears. They should break the chains of what is familiar in this life in order to recognize the absolute truth, which admits no restrictions of time, place, or temporal standards. As to what exactly happens to all these creations during the resurrection, we can only say that is known to God alone. We can only compare and comprehend with what we have experienced. When we think of a great upheaval in the world, our imagination cannot stretch beyond a violent earthquake or volcano, or perhaps the fall of a comet or a small celestial body. Floods are perhaps the most destructive manifestation of the power of water known to us. The most powerful events in this universe we have monitored were some limited, explosion in the sun, which is millions of miles away from us. All these events, the explosions in the sun, the earthquake, the volcano, the flood, all of these events, great as they may be, seem so small, perhaps a child's play, when they are compared to the universal turmoil which will take place on the day of resurrection, qiyamah. We ask Allah to clear our hearts and minds so when we read these verses, they bring us to full attention and keep us in focus where our priorities should be. We ask Allah to make us among those who will have a saving account full of good deeds and those who will end up in paradise. We ask Allah in that day to gather us and group us with His true servants and true believers. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asri innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu ala man ittaba'a al huda.